Exactly. That's as it should be. Tennis match. Ooh, look at you boys.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. It is my true honor to welcome you, both to those who are here with us in person and to those of you joining us on our live stream from across Canada and beyond. My name is Karen Collins, and I am honored to serve as the Director of Canada for the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. For those who are with us in person, I was going to acknowledge that we had envisioned a closer-knit, intimate setting, but wanted space to spread out, but we are full, and we are thrilled. We recognize the breadth, space, and beauty of the sanctuary, and hope that our conversation and your engagement this evening will help us make us feel closely connected. The Shalom Hartman Institute is a pluralistic think tank and educational center for the Jewish people. Our goal at Hartman is to enrich Jewish life through ideas and to support and strengthen leaders and learners by providing Jewish wisdom on contemporary issues. At Hartman, we focus and believe in the power of ideas to make change. This evening's program is a testament to this theory. In partnership with Holy Blossom Temple and the Kashitsky Center for Jewish Studies at York University, and with the support of the Azrieli Foundation, tonight's program will introduce ideas that will help us consider this moment in Israel's history and what this might mean for us as Canadians. Hartman Canada is growing. Through our programs, events, and engagement with leaders and learners like you, we are expanding Hartman's reach throughout the country and thinking more about Hartman ideas within the context of our Canadian sensibility. At Hartman, we often consider the idea of homeness, what it means to be home as Canadians whose own rich traditions and backgrounds are celebrated as part of the Canadian mosaic, and as a Canadian Jewish community who for many also consider Israel home. And it is with this in mind that I acknowledge the lands on which we gather from today are a shared home, shared with the people who were here caring for this land and its inhabitants before us. We acknowledge that Holy Blossom Temple is hosted on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, Ojibwa, Chippewa, and the Huron-Wendat peoples. We are grateful for the opportunity to gather on this land and strengthen our community through this gift of learning. And I am honored to have the opportunity to represent Canada at the Shalom Hartman Institute and take responsibility of learning, exploring, and dedicating myself to the sacred responsibilities of truth and reconciliation and to the 94 calls of action seriously through this work. And with that, it is now my pleasure to invite Rabbi Yael Splansky, Senior Rabbi here at Holy Blossom Temple and a member of Hartman's Rabbinic Leadership Initiative and a friend, to say a few words and continue with our introductions.
Erev Tov, everyone. This scene feels very familiar and very restorative, I have to say. Like many of the rabbis who are here tonight in person and online, I'm lucky enough to be able to study regularly with the faculty of the Shalom Hartman Institute. The Toronto Board of Rabbis enjoys a few classes every year, and now thanks to technology, we are joined by rabbis that serve Canadian communities from coast to coast. and I'm currently in my 4th year of a 3-year rabbinic fellowship with Hartman. Like many of you across the streams of Jewish life, I go to study in the classrooms and courtyards of the beautiful Jerusalem Stone campus. Why are rabbis and Jewish communal leaders and students of every life stage drawn to Hartman Torah? Because Jewish leadership can be lonely, and sometimes we can get stuck under the weight of it. The Hartman Institute brings people together so it is impossible to feel lonely. And the Hartman Institute brings challenging ideas forward so it is impossible to sit still. The Babylonian Talmud, Baba Batra, debates the multiple responsibilities that one generation has to the next. It is reassuring to see there that the anxiety we feel today about our capacity to provide a Jewish life that is compelling and relevant for the next generation, that is nothing new. Yoshua ben Gamla insists that school teachers must be trained and placed in each and every town so that children do not have to travel from town to town for learning. Rather, every child ought to be educated right where they live. But Rava explains that you can bring children from one synagogue where they learn to another synagogue where they can also learn. And what if there is a river that separates community from community, the Talmud asks? Do not bring the children across, lest, God forbid, they fall into the river. But if there is a bridge spanning the river, then you can bring them across for their learning. If there is a narrow bridge, however, do not bring them across. Rabbi Daniel Hartman and the extraordinary faculty of the Shalom Hartman Institute courageously and continuously devote themselves to the sacred work of teaching and bridge building. They are the teachers of teachers. They are the rabbis of rabbis, so that Jewish communities throughout Israel and North America can learn right where they live. With the ever-expanding technological tools, the Hartman Institute is expanding its reach and its influence throughout the Jewish world. Like Rava, Rabbi Hartman insists that people ought to travel from synagogue to synagogue for learning. He insists that the Jewish people thrives when we see and celebrate our collective strengths as we do tonight. But what happens when there is a river or even an ocean between us? We build a bridge, and not a narrow bridge. A narrow bridge is shaky, risky, even dangerous. Rabbi Daniel Hartman is a builder of bridges that are strong enough and wide enough to connect Israel and North American diaspora Jewry. It is not easy to be a bridge builder. It takes planning, creativity, experimentation, heavy lifting, funding, and a team of people who share in the same mission. Because the stakes are high, and the needs are so great, and the time seems so short, we don't have the luxury of building one bridge at a time either. Under Daniel's tireless and seemingly fearless leadership, the Hartman Institute is constructing multiple bridges simultaneously with urgency and passion, and we are the better for it. Thanks to the initiatives of the Hartman Institute, we can walk with greater confidence over the streams of Jewish life. Thanks to the leading voices of its esteemed faculty of thinkers, scholars, and dreamers, we can navigate with greater clarity between the complexities of Israel and diaspora communities. And thanks to the books, articles, journals, programs, and podcasts that they produce, we can stand a chance at crossing over the choppy waters of Jewish politics and peoplehood. Hartman's bridges protect us from falling. They protect us from being separated from one another, distanced from one another, ignorant of one another. These strong and wide bridges invite us to be curious about the people and the ideas on the other side, and enable us to go and to consider and to discover for ourselves. In a world which seems to be favoring walls over bridges once again, we thank God for the vision and the aspirations of the Shalom Hartman Institute. Tonight we will ask religion and democracy in Israel, what are the stakes for global Jewry? And two masterful teachers will guide us through the conversation. So please join me now in welcoming Rabbi Daniel Hartman and Professor David Kaufman. They are good for the Jews, and they are contributing in endless ways, and we are so grateful for their leadership.
Thank you, Rabbi Splansky. It's really an honor for me to be here tonight with you all and in conversation with you, Daniel, you who routinely bolsters my confidence that both the rabbinic and the prophetic instincts in our tradition are alive and well, and I too, like Yael, am very grateful, and I truly admire the work that you and all of your Shalom Hartman Institute team colleagues do in Israel and in North America to try to clear-headedly steer the global Jewish people onto a righteous path. So it gives me hope to speak with you. I come to tonight's conversation with some hope and also with some of the weariness, with the heaviness, with the dispirit of this moment that I think is probably shared, at least in part in this room tonight, as Israeli culture and society and politics shift before our eyes. We find ourselves in limbo between an election and a formed government, this limbo moment that doesn't have that much mystery, but a limbo moment nonetheless, right? The vote is in. We're expecting a Netanyahu-led government to form a coalition of Haredi parties with Itamar Ben-Gvir's far-right nationalist party, Otzma Yehudit, and a pretty jingoistic religious Zionist party led by Bezalel Smotrich. Gone is the experiment, suddenly gone is the experiment of a Bibi-free, pragmatic big tent coalition with centrists. It had secular right-wingers, left-wingers, religious Palestinian Israelis. I suppose there's a tiny chance that Bibi could form a centrist bloc instead, if Gantz and Lapid change their minds and decide to sit with Bibi. Maybe the specific corruption charges will be deemed less important than the overall direction of the country. Who knows? But we're anticipating. We're in a moment with a lot of anticipation right now. We're anticipating the most right-wing government of Israel's whole history, and we're anticipating some disturbing policies to be enacted by the Knesset. None of them have been formally tabled. Right? It hasn't happened yet. None of them have been passed in Knesset, of course. But there's a good deal of, I think, well-warranted anxiety about what this new pivot for Israel means for Israeli democracy, for its Supreme Court, for LGBTQ Jews, for non-Orthodox Jews, for migrant and non-Jewish ethnic minorities, Arab citizens particularly, for Israeli-Palestinian relations, for Israel's standing in the family of nations. I'm going to drop the mic if I open up my fingers more, for Israel, for Judaism in Israel, for Israel diaspora relations, and for diaspora Jews' relationships with their non-Jewish and their partly Jewish family members and friends and work colleagues and neighbors and fellow students and social media interlocutors and voting citizens. So too many to count on my fingers and too many issues to cover in one evening program. I feel some of the fright that comes with basically feeling a little powerless in shaping the destiny. For me, this kind of wary, heavy Israel consciousness also necessarily comes with some of the compounding forces of the global moment that we're in. Israelis are, of course, included in this, but there's a global pandemic, exhaustion, looming global recession, a good deal of angst at the state of civil discourse, pretty much everywhere in the globe, it seems, and always at the top of my mind, the global climate crisis. So I feel these weights as a Jew, I feel them as a university professor, I feel them as a father of 3 children, and sometimes I can feel these forces coalesce into a feeling, a terrifying feeling, and I say a tempting feeling of having my disempowerment metastasize into a kind of rage. Now, I'm not an angry guy, but there's more anger coming up in me, and it seems around me, and I just notice it. It's here. So I'd like to return to some of these kind of emotional questions of affect in a bit. But for starters, I'd like to ask you the question that we posed as the title of the program itself, which is, what's at stake for Diaspora Jewry that just wasn't when the good Hartman folks booked your ticket to come to speak in Toronto just 2 months ago?
Oh, what could have been? We could have celebrated. What's at stake? Everything. And I very much appreciated what you just stated. Because it's real, it's raw. And it's not pretending that everything's okay. And it is only that level of honesty that could give us a future. Because everything is at stake. And it's not going to go away by claiming, oh, Israel's such a vibrant democracy, look, we have to, and it is true, it is a vibrant democracy. But the most fundamental thing that's at stake is what type of democracy we're going to be. Are we going to be a democracy of the rule of the majority? And to what extent are we going to be bound by a sense of the inalienable rights, not so much of individuals, but of minorities? And so everything's at stake until the next election. But this government will live its 4 years. It'll be a very stable coalition. And over the next 4 years, it's not as if Israel is going to disappear or cease being a democracy. There will be legislation and policies that some of us find abhorrent. And some people will walk away. I hope most of us, or enough of us, are going to be planning the campaign. What's the Israel we care about? What's the Israel we want? And our job is going to be to articulate the Israel we want, not merely critique the Israel that we don't have. And because that criticism could become profoundly self-destructive. I understand it. But it's like almost the Just Not Bibi campaign had that quality to it. What do you stand for? And so what's at stake is, what is Zionism? What is a homeland of the Jewish people? What does that mean? We came back, after 2,000 years. We returned to power, we returned to sovereignty. And we thought that we had certain issues that we had to deal with. And our assumption was that the most fundamental issue we had to deal with is how do we protect ourselves in an area that that wants us dead. That was we thought that our greatest challenge was the animosity of our neighbors. And much of our country was built to deal with that question. Like the whole infrastructure was to create a viable, strong country. And we succeeded. We succeeded beyond our wildest imagination. But what's at stake is the vision and the mission of the country beyond its core survival. It's not about whether Israel will be, it's about what Israel will be. And many of us thought that was more or less under control. We thought the issue was Haredi birth rate, right? So, okay, there's a group which has a completely different vision. Their birth rate is very high. When is it that there's going to be a tipping point? That's not our problem anymore. That's part of our problem. But there's certain core fundamental questions. Now you gave a whole list, and I just want to speak. The biggest issue that we have to worry about are the rights of those individuals who can't demonstrate. Those who can't stand up for their own voices. The LGBTQ community has a strong voice in Israel. Not worried about their rights. They can come, they can demonstrate, they could speak, they could fight, and they have profound political power directly connected to the voice that you have in a democracy, even if you're a minority. What's at stake are those communities that can't demonstrate. Diaspora Jewry. You can't force Israelis to hear. The Judaisms which aren't represented in the government. Israeli Arabs. They're allowed to demonstrate. But they can't really demonstrate the way Jews demonstrate. Because very quickly they'll be called traitors, terrorists, enemies. So what's at stake is our future and how we maintain our relationships, not with minorities at risk only, but with some of the core values that we care about. And we're writing Jewish history now. We're writing Jewish history.
I like this idea of turning sort of away from the boundaries of outside the conversation to a conversation that has to happen internally. I reread your father's Zionism essays this weekend from his 1999 book, A Heart of Many Rooms, kind of looking for insight about what religious Zionism looks like today. And one of the essays, your father points to Gershom Scholem and his observation about secular Zionism, like the movement as a whole, that it was both a movement of continuity and of rebellion from Jewish history. So here's the quote. He says, "Secular Zionists rebelled against their tradition, but remained inside the national historical home of their parents. Zionism is like the young adult who rebels against his parent, cries out against their values, rejects nearly everything they stand for, and announces that he's going to leave home, never to return. He goes to the door, opens it with anger, closes it with a bang, but forgets to leave the house. So I think of your father's Torah. I love listening to your father. His Torah, which was, a Torah of religious pluralism, a Zionism of religious pluralism. In a way, it was very Canadian. It was very Montreal. It was about religious accommodation, about pluralism itself, about religion in a marketplace of ideas. And I can hear his voice in my head. I won't. My wife said, "Don't imitate him," but he says, "Make for yourself a heart of many rooms, and put in those who say that it's permitted, and put in those who say it's forbidden." Can you tell me about what you see as both the continuities and the rebellions of today's religious Zionism?
Religious Zionism had almost disappeared as an ideological movement. They were Zionists and religious. They had almost disappeared because the primary agenda of the religious Zionist community, besides being religious while they are Zionists, which is different than, let's say, the ultra-Orthodox, but they weren't providing an ideological reading of the essence of Zionism. They had when the movement, when Zionism started. Even the settler movement had a read on Zionism, which spoke about the inherent connection between Zionism and the land, built on Kabbalistic categories, which saw the land as integral to redemption. And therefore Zionism, religious Zionism, was about utilizing religious principles to bring about the redemption of the world. But after 2005 and the unilateral withdrawal from Gaza, the Zionist movement, the religious Zionist movement, while there are still writers publicly, stopped talking about the Messianic era and the holiness of the land. And they did that because in the unilateral withdrawal from Gaza, Israelis basically said, we don't care about the holiness of the land, we worry about the safety of our children. And Israelis, the majority were for withdrawing from Gaza, not because of Palestinian rights. Anybody who tells you that the unilateral withdrawal from Gaza was a peace play is just not aware of what was going on. That's just not true. It wasn't a peace play. It was Israelis were not willing to have their sons, and at the time it was just sons, be in danger to protect the 8,000 Israelis living in Gaza. We just didn't want it. So Israelis said, land, schmland, holiness, all of the above, Kabbalistic categories, knock yourself out, I want my kids home. We're out. We're gone. So in the battle between, used to be, who do you love? Do you love the land or do you love the people? The left wing and the center said we love the people over the land. Religious Zionism very astutely recognized that they were advocating for an ideology that Israelis weren't interested in. And they shifted to basically becoming a far right, and it's not economically, it's not on guns, it's not on abortion, it's not on environment. in Israel, everybody knows there's global warming. It doesn't matter who you vote for. It's not, there's certain, it was just politically right-wing on issues of security. And advocating for holding on to Judea and Samaria, not because it is the Holy Land, and not because it's necessary for the unfolding of the divine plan for history, but it's necessary because a two-state solution is dangerous for the people of Israel. So the right wing basically took the ideology of the left. Do you care for the land or do you care for the people? And they said, we're the ones who really care for the people. You're not caring for the people. And part of the campaign was, you don't care for the Jews. You care for Palestinians. Like, it was part of the game. Like, are you really care? Who do you really care for? And they co-opted the essential feature of the center, the left, or the peace camp. And it's one of and the peace camp never was able to find its legs. And that's why it slowly disappeared, because what are you going to advocate for? You're going to advocate for human rights, for people who want to kill you? That's, even if people want to kill you have rights, it's a losing campaign. It's very difficult. And so the religious Zionist community evolved. Like Naftali Bennett represented. Like, do you remember the size of Naftali Bennett's kippah? No, it represented very clearly. It's like he was liberal when he was minister of education. He advocated for religious diversity, pluralism. When he was the minister of diaspora affairs, he initiated and pushed for developing the Kotel deal. That was him. On every issue, he was liberal, with the exception of one, and that is security. And he was to the right of Netanyahu because Netanyahu was always willing to compromise. If America pushed, if Realpolitik pushed, if Saudi Arabia or the Abraham Accords pushed, Netanyahu was the one who withdrew in the Y Accords from Hebron. Like, So he was the right-wing protector. That was his job. He said, if you really care about issues of security, come to me. I'm there. That was the religious Zionist camp. Part of what changed right now, and this is a much larger story that I want to avoid very long answers. But part of what happened is that the religious Zionist camp of Smotrich very astutely ran under the name religious Zionist. And most people in the religious Zionist community are like Bennett. They're not interested. They're fine. They're not worried about the fact that there are 19 Jews who are converted by the Reform movement who want to make Aliyah. They're very sensitive to the fact that Israel has to represent and Jewish diversity. What they're not sensitive, are issues of security. And Smotrich is creating a package which is ideological. It's reclaiming a certain vision of religious Zionism that has to do with religious legislation, a lot of other issues. So that's the shift.
Right. I mean, you're describing it almost as a secularization of religious Zionists. They don't care about any of these religious categories anymore. They care about security and security only.
But not anymore.
But
Smotrich cares.
Right.
See, that's what happened. The vast majority of the community, but he's their representative. So he's bringing with him a whole other agenda, right, which is not necessarily the agenda of the religious. There is a deep secularization of the religious Zionist community, which is not. But he owns the mandate, And people who voted for him bought the whole package, and he very astutely hid much of the issues in his campaign. So did Ben-Gvir.
Let's talk about Ben-Gvir a little bit and about Jewish might. You know, we have Otzma Yehudit's full-throated embrace of the language of power, and it comes at a time when the progressive left, generally speaking, seems quite uncomfortable with power, precisely because it's fundamentally preoccupied with power relations, with oppression. So I'd like some help unpacking what's at stake here, kind of emotionally for Israelis about power. It's a two-part question, though, so bear with me for the long one. Are we seeing a reaction to insecurity, existential anxiety? Like, is this flirtation with or embrace of very right-wing ideas? Is it a product of Jews, throwing off the yoke of victimhood? Or is it the mantle of those who genuinely feel themselves to be victims and besieged, and therefore entitled to embrace the politics of just raw power? So you folks at Hartman are very keen on talking about power and vulnerability, and it's mostly about the dangers of power, which is a good thing to talk about. I'm interested in hearing you talk about its seductiveness.
Right.
And about what amount or what quality of Jewish might can and should actually be embraced by Israelis. I want you to answer that. I have a follow-up about this kind of similar theme about diaspora Jews, but maybe you'll take a stab at that one first.
In the next sources, I just wrote a long article on power. And I've been working on it for quite a while. The first thing is that as an Israeli, and I won't speak about Israelis and here separate myself. As an Israeli, I love Jewish power. I love it. I love power. I'm worried about it, but it doesn't stop me from. I love it. I appreciate it. I do. If I had a choice between powerful or powerless, I pick powerful any day of the week. Any day of the week. I am so happy that we have power. I am so happy that we have disproportionate power. But power is a means, not an end. Now, most Israelis are completely unapologetic about Jewish power. And maybe that might be a difference, the source of a core difference between diaspora Jews and Israelis. Completely unapologetic about it. I love it. I appreciate it. It gives to my life meaning. I feel that one of the core missions, what does it mean to be a human being? According to Genesis 1, to be a human being is to be created in the image of God, and to be created in the image of God, according to Genesis 1, is to be given the power to rule the world and master it. And for me, Zionism is returning to the Jewish people power. That's where we start. But there is a profound challenge as to how to use that power justly. Now, for most of Israel's history, we put that question aside. Because if we are the Israel Defense Forces, if we are essentially under attack, when you are using your power in self-defense, you are self-evidently justified in doing so.
Every time.
And therefore, you don't even have to think about the question. Literally, even if not everything we did is justifiable all the time, and I personally fought in a war which violated that core principle in the first war in Lebanon. It was not a war of self-defense, or at least the war that I fought in against Syrians to set up a new order in Lebanon was not a war of self-defense. By and large, we just remove that from the agenda. We are, at the time, 3 million, 5 million. Now we're close to 10 million. We are endangered by our surroundings. We are the Israel Defense People. That's it. We're defending ourselves. One way of understanding the challenge that Israel faces and the rise of Otzma Yehudit is that we, like most Jews in the world, haven't internalized our victory. We just haven't, we won. Like, we haven't internalized it. We won. I'm not at war. I'm not endangered by Israeli-Palestinian citizens. They're my citizens. I'm not in danger. I'm not in 48 when there were 600,000 Jews in Israel. I'm not in the 50s when we're trying to create a viable country. I'm not even post-67 when the Arab armies around me are still outnumber us. We haven't internalized that we are one of the most powerful countries in the world. We might have the 5th most powerful army in the world. With the exception of Iran, there's no one in the neighborhood who, not only do they not endanger us, they don't even make us nervous. Now, what does that mean? We still see ourselves. And we still see ourselves as an embattled minority with a precarious existence. Now, when that's what you feel, and you have an inordinate amount of power, and you still define it exclusively in terms of self-defense, the potential for abuse is significant. And Ben Gvir and Otzma Yehudit marketed to a people who still have this fear and said to them, you know, we have the power. Why are you letting them endanger you? Now, are there challenges of crime in Israel? Sure. Are there challenges between Israeli Palestinians and Israeli Jews? Sure. Are Israeli Palestinians the greatest source of crime in Israel? No. Ludicrous. It's ludicrous. So I even had this conversation. Like, this is a real conversation. Like, with actually a North American Jew. Oh, I hear things are terrible in the Negev. I heard about that story of a Palestinian who raped a 10-year-old girl. Terrible, terrible story. I said, you know there's Jewish rapists too. And he said, I didn't hear. He says, there was a case where Jews were raping Palestinians? I said, no, you idiot. Jews are raping Jews all the time. Not all the time. It's just like this, you know. So here it is, you could tell a story and you have a society at fear with the power to do anything. And Otzma Yehudit says, what do you want? Why aren't you using your power to defend yourself? And so there's the only group in Israel which seriously deals with the moral responsibility of power is the army. There's a code of ethic, and they talk about it all the time. In the army, you train regularly on how you use your power, on who you fire on, when you fire? How do you conduct yourself? The army doesn't mean it doesn't abuse. Power will always be abused. Always. If you have it, you're also going to abuse it. There's no such, you lose your purity when you have power. It's inevitable. But they talk about it. We struggle with it. It was a lifetime ago, but I remember in the first war in Lebanon, we didn't see any Palestinian terrorists. My unit, we were fighting Syrians the whole time. We had nothing to do with the other war. Our job was to fight Syrians and set up a new order in Lebanon, run by the Christian Phalangists. There were 2 Palestinian terrorists who somehow left the Western Front and somehow ended up in the Eastern Front. And we captured them, took them prisoner, and their money disappeared. In the middle of the war, 2 tankists, their tank was literally, how do you say mushbat in English? From Shabbos, not rested. It was sidelined in the middle, and we were getting cut down by the Syrians. We needed everybody. Our deaths and casualties were horrific. We sidelined a tank because the commander says, "You're not fighting in my army. You stole from 2 prisoners of war." It was like, and this was standard. The army does this all the time. Of course, soldiers will abuse it. The army polices it. The society doesn't have a sufficient enough ethic commensurate with its power. And that's one way of understanding the dilemma of Israel and the rise of this party of Jewish power.
So I'm hoping you can speak about the sort of seductiveness of this position for diaspora Jews as well. I've heard you describe American Jewry as overwhelmingly liberal many times, and it's true. For Canadian Jewry too. We did a survey a couple years ago that found that for all of our comparatively strong connection to Israel as Canadians, compared with the U.S., the majority of Canadian Jews, don't think that Israel has been genuine about peace, and young Jews in particular are more Israel hesitant. That was 4 years ago. This new government, of course, will be extra challenging for formal Canada-Israel relations, and for those who are sort of, for the already difficult Israel conversation among Canadian Jews. But I find myself worrying also about the number of Jews in Canada and maybe in France and the UK and the US as well, who, in the secrecy of the ballot box, if they could go to the Israeli ballot box, might also feel the attraction of Jewish might. So what would you say to the secret heart diaspora Jew who has been emotionally connected to Israel precisely because of its strength, because of its security as a refuge, if need be, with feelings of great pride about Israel's might, and thinks, it's okay to put my family and my tribe first in this, nasty dog-eat-dog world, and perhaps a little less disturbed about the finer points of democratic administration. And we have them in our community. There's lots of people who are like, this is actually appealing.
See, I understand the temptation and the pride that Israel's power provides. As I said, in my own life, I love the power that I have. And I don't apologize. I love it. I love the fact that I'm not a victim. I love not being a victim. I love the fact that if I'm in danger, I could try. Nobody's independent. But I could defend myself. I love that fact. That's just like, I find that's an inalienable right, and I could appreciate world Jewry in a post-67 move, feeling, oh wow. I was in grade 3 at the time, but I remember the fear before 67. We didn't know if we were going to win. And then when you juxtapose that with the victory, see, so I understand that. Now, to Jews who are intoxicated by Israel's power, and that causes them to ignore our moral responsibility to those who are governed by our power. I believe you are both Jewishly and morally flawed. You are Jewishly and morally deficient. As the religious Zionists, like Rabbi Kook and Rabbi Amiel, before the state, said Jewish nationalism is going to be a unique nationalism because it's going to be a nationalism grounded on universal values. They had a vision. So when I see people for whom their pride in nationalism causes them to be morally insensitive to those whose lives you are responsible for, I think you're Jewishly and morally flawed. I think there's something core about, again, it's one of the dangers of power, is that it blinds you to your morals, because it's so comfortable, and it's a power not only to defend yourself, it's also a power not to care what other people say. It's the power to define your own conversation, to determine yourself as being right by definition, to declare anybody who disagrees with you as factually flawed, fake. You know, when you're powerful, you both have the power to do and the power to shape and the power to, now also if you're economically, also there's sometimes an age discrepancy. If you're sitting in positions of power, you can determine who could speak, when they could speak, who gets it's nice. It's quite comfortable. Now, such individuals, just like, again, if you're out, when you're in Israel, I'm more worried. When you're outside of Israel, I'm not worried about you, I'm worried for you, if that makes sense. Because as a teacher of Jewish law, Judaism starts by teaching us that all human beings are created in the image of God. We have a crazy tradition. It doesn't start with the Jews. It only gets to the Jews 12 chapters later. The first 12 chapters are about our relationship and God's relationship with the world. And so there's something there's a Torah I have to teach you. There's something, power is causing you to advocate for things in Israel that you would never advocate for here in Canada. You never would. You never would. And that's one of our problems, is that here, when we come to Israel, that's a double standard. We also have a double standard in which we give ourselves or allow ourselves certain moral license that we would never allow ourselves here. And another way of defining the challenge is that being a minority, being in the diaspora, you're always worried about what somebody will say about you. You're worried about how it looks. It's a shanda. A shanda is a great moral corrective. Because if it's a shanda, and you know I don't speak Yiddish, but there's like a few words that I learned. Shanda mitagoyim. It's not shanda. It's like, what are they going to say? What are they going to say? So when you're worried about what they're going to say, you internalize. And you create a corrective that even if you don't believe it, you don't want it to appear in a certain light. But the experience of Israel is that there's nobody who we're worried about their moral approval. Like, am I worried about what Assad thinks about me? Like, I have my own part of what happens in Israel is that being a majority, insulates you from the moral corrective of your external critic. And so when we're powerful, you don't have an external critic, and those same Jews who in Canada would never advocate, ever advocate. A Jew outside of Israel always stands with the minority. The problem is that because we're a minority, doing so is in our own self-interest. So now when it comes to Israel, how do you stand with minorities, not because it's in your self-interest, because it's your moral responsibility? Now you're tested. So that's why I'm not worried about them.
Right.
I'm worried for them.
I had the fortunate opportunity to attend in the spring the first ever Canada-Israel summit. It was in Ottawa a few months ago with community leaders and the Israeli consul generals and the then ambassador Ronen Hoffman. It was very engaging. A few days at the conclusion of the summit, to my surprise, Ambassador Hoffman asked all of us to think about ways, not that we could support Canada-Israel relations kind of in the old-fashioned ways of philanthropic support for NGOs or universities or civil society and the like, and not even to help improve bilateral business connections, but with a focus, this is what he said, on ways that the Jewish community in Canada might help the Israeli government find clean water solutions to First Nations communities in Canada. And in thinking, he asked this, if we could help him think through how the language of Indigenous reconciliation in Canada might be applied to Israeli-Palestinian relations. I was totally shocked. It didn't come up in the conversation among these Jewish leaders at all, but in the ambassador's formal, summation, this is what he put to these Jewish leaders. I find myself, I imagine that the next ambassador to Canada will not be speaking the same language, but I find myself wondering, as many Canadians I think do, about the utility and the perils, about the truthfulness and the untruthfulness about thinking about Israel through the lens of indigeneity, which is something on the minds of lots of Canadians, lots of Canadian Jews, given where our national conversation is. So I don't know if you want to speak to that specifically or just maybe a broader, this is the kind of Canadian moment, but I, as a very astute observer of the Jewish world, not just in Israel, but of the diaspora, I'm wondering if you can share any insights about some of the nuances between diaspora Jewries in Canada, in France or Australia or the UK. Like, are we all in the same boat, or do we each bring something unique to this conversation as diaspora Jews?
First, by the way, anybody in Israel who is fortunate enough to be sent by Israel to serve overseas grows morally. And the mere fact that they have to talk to you, he might be the real deal, but he has to speak to you. Israel's foreign service are outstanding individuals. But it's part of, they need to speak to you. So there are some those who aren't astute, think that, how do I get you into my conversation? Those who are more skilled know that that's not the way you sell. You sell by knowing your audience and talking to them in a language that's relevant to them. And so there is hope. But that goes back to not the last part, but part of your question. First of all, it's self-evident that wherever we are, we have opportunities to learn. So Jews who are suffering from anti-Semitism have to remind us that the world is not yet redeemed. And we have to remember that. That's an important lesson too. Jews who are in positions of power in the diaspora as a beloved minority have to teach us that not everyone in the world hates us all the time. That's also a very important lesson. So each community has very different experiences. Now, this goes to what I believe is the essential conversation of Zionism. It's our challenge now is whatever it is that the Israeli government says and does, what is the Zionist conversation that we have now? What does it mean to be a Zionist in Canada? Does being a Zionist in Canada mean that our job is to defend Israel against its enemies? Part of it. But I don't think that's the major job of a Zionist anymore. I think we love to get into the defense mode here too. Let's be the Zionist Defense Forces of Israel. The Canadian, what would be the C, you figure it out. The CZDF. It's really catchy. The ZITFs, we're the ZITFs. That would be a very moving thing to be. Oh, you're defending Israel on its borders, I'm defending it here. And it's a high. Now, I appreciate very much anybody who defends Israel, wherever it may be. I don't want to belittle that. Listen, I love Israel and I care about its survival, and anybody who helps to protect Israel against anybody who wants to delegitimize it or undermine it shares with me in the burdens of the state of Israel. But I think in many ways, we're only fighting part of the war because, again, we're concentrating on the borders. The real battle we face now is whether there's going to be a Zionism in Canada. Not whether Israel is going to survive anti-Israel forces, but whether there's going to be any Jews who are going to want to stand up, whether your children, your grandchildren, and some of you, are you going to want to stand up and say, yeah, Israel's an integral part of my Jewish life? That's what it means to be a Zionist. To be a Zionist is not to say Israel has a right to exist. Give me a break. You know, really, Israel has a right to exist? I exist. Like, thank you so much. I really am touched that you recognize my right to exist. I'm like, it's a sanctuary, so I won't use other terms, like about what I think. Like I mean, like, so nice of you. That's not what a Zionist means. A Zionist is someone who says that to be a Jew is to live in relationship with my community here and also in the community of Jews who live in Israel. Half the Jewish people live in Israel. We have returned to the homeland of the Jewish people. We are building a homeland of the Jewish people. And that to be in relationship with Israel is an integral part of the way I do Judaism. It's not which shul I belong to alone, or how I keep kosher, or which denomination. It's just, that's part of the story. It's not just Shabbos, it's not rituals, it's to be a part of a people and to see Jewish nationhood as an integral part of what it means to be a Jew. But that means I have to talk about what Jewish nationhood means. And as a Canadian, you have an idea about what Jewish nationhood should be. That's what you should be talking about. To be a Zionist is to talk about the Israel that you want. To be a Zionist is to make Israel a morally compelling conversation amongst yourselves first. How do you deal with the gap between your Zionism and Israel? That's a second stage. Then you need to ask, how do I influence? How do I shape Israel? But the first, what is the Israel you want? You can't be a Zionist unless you think about that question. Just like the ambassador, he didn't say yes to be a Zionist is to accept that whatever I in Israel do is wonderful. That's not to be a Zionist. That's to be an idol worshiper. That's idolatry. To say amen about by definition, to anything that a human being, any human creation, that's idolatry. To be a Zionist is to dream about what Jewish power and what Jewish statehood should mean. How do we treat minorities? What does it mean for the Jewish people to have come back to power? And how do we do it right? And what have you learned in Canada that applies to the Middle East? Knowing fully well that not everything that you've learned in Canada applies to the Middle East. There might be some things that don't apply. But there are a lot of things that do. And one thing clearly does. And that is the essence of diaspora Jewish life is to reject any distinction between the value of the life of a Jew and the value of a life of a non-Jew. That is the ABC of all diasporic Torah. The ABC of diasporic Torah is that all human beings are created in the image of God. And if Jews are chosen, chosenness is not a gift, chosenness is a responsibility. This is the ABC across the world. Okay, that's your Torah. Now in Canada, because you're exceptionally nice, and it's difficult traveling from the United States to Canada, back to the United States. Also coming from Israel, because you're just nicer than most people. You are, you're just nice people. So, but that, you have a heightened sense of moral sensitivity and responsibility. Great. To be a Zionist is to bring that to the conversation. And part of the story is, listen, we had a democratic election, I lost. Okay. I just have more work to do. I have to figure out how I spend the next 4 years convincing 10% of the population to shift. I don't need to convince everybody. So get busy. But if you're not going to get busy, if to be a Zionist is you're constantly worried about that's why your introduction was a Zionist statement. Because we're not going to be Zionists by ignoring the problem. When you ignore the problem, there's going to be less Zionists in 4 years' time. I could promise you. Any one of you who thinks that you're going to defend Israel by ignoring the problem, and by talking about Israel's ability to harvest water, there's going to be less Zionists in Canada in 4 years' time. The Zionist camp cannot allow the non-Zionist camp to monopolize the moral discourse. They can't. We have to own it. Why? Because I'm a Zionist. Because I care about Israel. What do we think when I criticize Israel? I want to aspire for what Israel should be. That's the conversation that we need to have. And frankly, the more Canadians are involved in that conversation, as long as you bring the same ideology that you apply to Canada, don't park it at home when you come to Israel. Again, my father used to joke. He had a lot of great lines. And that one, the one you quoted, one of it was, he says, I don't know what goes on in El Al, but for some reason, anytime someone from North America makes Aliyah, something happens with the food on El Al. They land in Israel and become ultranationalists. Like there's something like, poof. Zionism is not about ultranationalism. Zionism is about universal nationalism. That's what it's, okay. So you're really good at that. I want your voices to ring loud and clear and with pride and love for the country that you would like to have.
We Jews in Canada have, and many places in the diaspora have a lot of non-Jews in our midst. We're married to them. Half of our, we're Jewish and something else as well. And this sort of ABC's point, I think, is good. I have one last quick question that I'd like to open up to the floor. On election night, you had on your podcast, you called for a scrapping of your institutes. game plan. And even before the results were in, you were talking about how Hartman has to pivot. It's the actual work that your institute does to pull some of the reactionary, sort of fearful, arrogant right back towards consensus democracy, and to bring diaspora Jews back into the camp of being part of the troubled committed, your great phrase in your writing. And, you know, you've been announcing this kind of vision for a redirection. You said, you know, that it was reasonable to argue, you know, on election night or even a week later, that it weren't ready for strategies. You had this great bit about being in Shiva, and now Shiva's over and you're ready to get up and get back to work. But it's Shloshim, you're still in mourning, but you're back at work. I'm just wondering if you might be able to share some tachlis, if you're ready to share it on, you know, if a vision is emerging on what you can actually do.
Hi. Did you say this was a short? I'll keep it really short. I have worked, and for me now, I have articulated 4 or 5 key areas which we have to work on. I don't necessarily yet have the exact business plan, but I know the areas. And I'll just share one with you for tonight. For me, the front line of Zionism right now, and that on which Zionism will be tested first, second, and third, is in our treatment of Israeli Palestinians. West Bank, Judea and Samaria, complicated, even though I hate that term. Complicated. I think we can do much better. I think my colleague Micha Goodman, and even though he was viciously attacked, I think shrinking the conflict was actually, it's an important contribution to our discussion. It was asking us, how do we live in an impossible situation that we cannot change, but are there ways that we can do it better? I think that's a healthy conversation. But right now, there is so much instability in Palestinian leadership in Judea and Samaria and Gaza that there's nothing that this government will be not radically different than the previous government. There might be more settlements, but that's not changing the status quo dramatically. There isn't going to be another 500,000 settlers over the next 4 years. It's just not what's going to be. What will change is settlers who live there in illegal settlements will now have legal settlements, but they're legal anyway. They were de facto legal. Israel paves roads, protects them, and connects them to the electrical grid. So tell me, are they legal or illegal? So that's the game changer of this government is not going to be in Judea and Samaria. It's just not going to be. And Netanyahu is always profoundly realistic and very minimalistic in his use of military power. He's one of the most careful users of military power of any prime minister. Far more careful than prime ministers in the left. Very, very careful. Very. There's not going to be dramatic changes. There are going to be major changes on issues of state and religion, and we're going to have to deal with that. That's one. But we could win when it comes to the sensibilities of Israeli Arab Palestinians, of their feeling of being at home. Just like you said, Canadians, you love living. You're at home in Canada. An Israeli Palestinian can't say that sentence. They can't say they're at home. We can win that one. We will have to change. They don't endanger Israel's security. They are loyal citizens of the State of Israel. But what does it mean to be a loyal citizen of the State of Israel when you're a Palestinian? Are they supposed to be Zionists? Are they supposed to get up and say, yes, for 2,000 years I was chalishing for you to come home? Like, oh, that's the demand? They can't be Zionists. And so one of the big shifts that I already started a year ago, but I'm gonna escalate this tenfold, is I have turned coexistence work in Israel into being one of the major initiatives of the Institute. It's going to be 20% of what we do. And I used to work, most of my work was on the rights of different types of Jews in the homeland of the State of Israel, and that will still be the major part. How does Judaism address modernity? How do Jews deal with the fact that Jews disagree? And this will be a big fight. In this government, it's going to get more complicated.
Yep.
But it cannot be that we who understand what it means to be a minority come home and don't make minority rights one of the most significant principles of Jewish statehood. That is not what Jews are supposed to be or do according to Jewish law. According to Jewish law. And so here, we have an opportunity. Very recently, just a few months ago, I hired a major non-Zionist, because how could she be, Palestinian woman leader, not just to run this new department of coexistence, but she is one of the 5 members of the executive committee of the Hartman Institute in Israel. She is one of the owners. She has, what do they call it, a minaya. She owns...
A veto?
No, a stock. What is it? You own a share.
A share, right.
We own a share. She's a share owner of the Institute. It's her home. I said, it's your home. She said, why are you hiring me? I said, because I want to do the right thing. I want Zionism to represent the best of what the Jewish people can be. And I don't know how to do it on my own. I need you. If you're willing to come into this, my home, I'm going to make this your home. And so, in the midst of those who are going to try to promulgate fear and make Israelis, Jews, worried about Israeli Palestinians, we're going to try to teach a different Torah. It's not a Torah that is soft on crime, but it's an awareness that Palestinians aren't the source of crime. Yes, there are Palestinian criminals, and there are Jewish ones too. They're my citizens. And part of what we need to do, you could agree with this, pick your issue. We're not going to be able to transform Israel into Canada in the next 4 years. Find the issue where victory is possible. Forget even victory, where progress is possible. Find the area where, despite the ease of manipulating people with the politics of fear, you can also help people transcend it. Find that area. then you will find partners in Israel. And so part of what's, there's a whole lot of things. I have a whole, like, I always have plans. I have plans. And I actually implement a lot of them. But there's going to be a lot of change. You're laughing, but my board members here know me very, very well. Part of what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to recognize that overnight, Israel did not become a fascist state. There is a language of fear. There are people. Again, I also want you to remember that in the last election, even though one coalition side won, the electorate was divided 50-50. There might have been a 4,000 vote difference between the two sides. And that means that half of Israel, for the first time, actually ran and voted for Jewish parties who said, I want to sit with Israeli-Palestinian parties. Not after the fact as a surprise, knew it in advance, voted for a coalition to live with this. So, okay. But there's another half who weren't part of the coalition, who felt disenfranchised. Not all of them are my enemy. Like, oh, this might be a helpful way to end. My daughter recently, a year ago, married somebody who grew up in the settlement of Beit El. A very nationalist, religious nationalist, right-wing settlement. And we had 3 weeks ago, no, it's actually now 4 weeks, time's flying. No, 3 weeks ago, we had on Shabbos a bris for my latest grandson. Mazel tov, thank you. It was a Shabbos bris. His whole family came for Shabbos. Every one of them voted for Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. Every single one. At my table, in my house. At the end of Shabbos, one of my son-in-law's, brother-in-laws said to me, Daniel, don't worry about Ben-Gvir. He's not as bad as you think he is. Now, whether he's right or wrong will be interesting. But when he said he's not as bad as you think he is, he was saying, I don't want that either. So here, that means he's not my enemy. That means there's somebody I could work with here. I want you to understand, I am an optimist, but I'm not a fool. But so I might be fooling myself. But what did he just say to me? He said, I'm not a racist. Ben-Gvir is not, even though he sounds, even though it's the whole thing about a duck and what a duck does and if it quacks like it is a duck, but he might sound like a racist, ultra-nationalist fascist, but he's not. That means he himself is saying, I don't want that. That's not why I'm voting for him. So I want to test it. I want to find those areas where we could create coalitions beyond my community, beyond the people. And Israeli Arabs, Palestinians is a very, very good place to start. And if we can make progress there, and again, if you notice or following any of the conversation, the delegitimizing Israel, they're not attacking anymore Israel for its policies in Judea and Samaria. The argument is that there's now systemic apartheid discrimination across all the borders. I don't think it's correct, but I want to prove that it's completely wrong. And that, fighting for that, is a worthwhile Zionist endeavor. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you.
The Hartman Institute likes to multiply questions. If we had formal Q&A here, we would only have time for one or two. So instead, we're going to multiply the questions and conversations in the atrium. Everyone is invited to stay. For concluding remarks, it is my pleasure to invite Liz Wolfe forward. She is a leader of the Toronto Jewish community. She is a longtime advisor and supporter of the Hartman Institute, and she is the current chair of the Canadian Friends of the Shalom Hartman Institute.
Thank you, Rabbi Splansky, and thank you all for listening so intently and attentively tonight. I'll be brief. I just want to really extend on your behalf our heartfelt thanks to both David Kaufman and Danielle Hartman. David, firstly, thank you for articulating our deep-seated emotions, both with respect to Israel generally and post-election, because I think you really conveyed the sense of deep connection that we have as Canadian Jews to Israel, and also deep angst, anxiety, fear, trepidation. I wrote down a list of the emotions that you expressed, and I thought, you've covered it, but the sense is that we care, we're concerned, we're disturbed. Danielle, I want to thank you for regaining your equilibrium, because if you listened, as Professor Kaufman indicated, to the podcasts on election night and the week later, you weren't as even-keeled as you are tonight. You were reeling, I think. You were all reeling from the results of the election and what it might mean for the state of Israel and Israel-diaspora relations over the next few years. I hear a different voice tonight. I hear a voice that goes back to saying, what is our mission? What are our questions? What's our task ahead, and is it achievable? The fact that you can phrase it, and we can go back to the question that what is our moral responsibility in the face of power? What are those questions? How do we have to deal with all the issues that you've dealt with over the decades of Israel as a sovereign state, and how our Judaism defines and determines and influences political decisions and economic decisions and societal decisions, but we're still there. And we haven't reached a stage where all is lost. There is hope. I leave here tonight that there is hope, and that there is opportunity, and that there is a role for we as Canadian Jews to play. We who are among the frustrated, unenfranchised, who are feeling that. But I want to hope that we are together with you on the mission of progress, and the mission to not go over the edge, not know that things are not as bad as they might seem in the moment, and that there are voices like Danielle Hartman, like the Hartman Institute, who are articulating the possibility going forward. So for that, I thank you both. I thank Rabbi Splansky for really making the evenings possible in this venue, and being here with us. As our sponsors and our hosts, Holy Blossom Temple and the Koschitzky Center for Jewish Studies at York, they both helped make this evening possible, and we are grateful to them. We're grateful for their ongoing partnership and their efforts with the Hartman Institute. Always, we have to thank the Israeli Foundation for its vision and its commitment to support the work of the Shalom Hartman Institute in Canada. I want to thank the Hartman staff on the ground, Karen Collins, Gila Axelrod, and Abigail Steinman, who were in helping this evening. Having a person in Canada, in Toronto, to steer and shepherd the work of the Hartman Institute is making an enormous difference to our presence here, to the opportunities here. And we hope you'll all continue to participate and engage. If you don't know, please go to the website, which sometimes they say is shalomhartman.org, but it goes to hartmanorg.il, and you will see the myriad of opportunities to participate and learn with Hartman through the podcasts, For Heaven's Sake, Identity Crisis, the new one, Heretic in the House, and sometimes, Hartman on the CJN also works. Please join for the free virtual classes and consider participating in the Community Leadership Program in Israel in June, where you can partake of more Hartman learning for a week. Intense. Please take a look, participate as you can. We welcome your engagement. And if you're able, go to the donate button. There's a donate button on the website. Hartman only survives based on contributions of the people who participate and appreciate and support its work. So we always encourage that. And with that, I'm going to invite you to continue the conversation in the atrium, where we have cookies and something to eat, and also go to the second floor if you have a moment. We have there's an exhibition on the 100 Years of Jaius for you to visit. So thank you all for coming. We appreciate your being here, and look forward to seeing you again at our next live event.